Hello. I've been meaning to make a film of this for a while, so I'm going to have a go. I've tried screen capture, but instead I'm going to try and film the laptop screen. I want to discuss a photo that I found in this book called the 1912 or the year 1912 Illustrated. Let me just find the photograph. It depicts, it's the one shown on the right on screen. Here it is in the book, and it depicts an event that happened in 1912, which was the flood, or the flooding of Norwich. So I found this photograph, and I thought I'll have a look for some similar photographs on the internet, and indeed I found this one that looks identical on the left. It's certainly the same street, but when you look at the angle from which it was taken, it must have been a slightly different location for the camera, or a different zoom setting perhaps, but certainly when you look at, if that's possible there, but certainly when you look at the people, you see them as being virtually identical. In fact, they are identical apart from really three characters, and if I zoom in we can just have a look at the ones that are different before we look at the ones that are the same. We've got this young chap here. If I go to the left, we'll see he's here on there, just that. And he's clearly just moved his head away before this shot was taken, or after the shot was taken. There can only be seconds between these two shots, and I think that's the fascinating thing when you look at the absolute similarities between many of the characters. The problem I have with it is that I somehow don't think they should exist together, because there's too many identical similarities and there's radical differences in some of the architecture. If you just look at the architecture for a minute, this wall here, along with this sign, obviously the camera on the left was further to the right. It was the only way to have captured less of that wall protruding. But the curious thing is that at the end you've got an identical array of these what look like arches, and indeed if you float a section, I'll do it in a bit, of the arches over the top, they match perfectly, and I can't understand how this distance can be maintained over such a distance with what would need to be quite a bit of a variation of the camera positioning here. And what's intriguing is that the similarities in the characters that are children, the ones that are identical are literally identical, but it's clearly a different viewpoint. If we look at this character down here, there's a bit of text on this one. It says the younger element think it fine fun. Certainly if we look at this this group of people, or this chap down here, we can see there's what looks like a young girl peering over his shoulder, and then we've got, let's just take away that selection. I struggle with the tech, and screen grab is just not going to work for me, so I hope this works. But if you zoom in on this chap here, and this one will fill the screen, but we'll zoom in on it and hopefully get a better view. If we zoom in on it, they are absolutely identical in the way they are looking. But the curious thing is they're all looking at the camera, apart from the ones that are but the ones that are looking at the camera are identical in every way. If you float a section of this, and I know there's distortion, they're different photographs, and there's distortion from the lenses used or in the process of creating the photograph, but it's curious that everything is identical, apart from just a few characters that are different, and the ones that are different, like I say, there's this chap on the left in the water here that's different. Let me just get the pointer, hopefully you can see that. This chap on the left here looking a different way. Actually all the people in, I'll just make it a bit smaller, sorry, all the people in the boat, albeit from this slightly different angle, are absolutely identically positioned but looking at each camera in turn. You've then got this chap here who is identical, gripping his lapels. There's the chap with the stick who, let's just zoom in a bit, he is identical in both pictures, yet his orientation in the photograph is away because of the position of the camera, but it just seems peculiar to me that we could get such differences and yet so many similarities. This chap leaning against the window, the door frame here, identical in his position and his glare. And this chap looks a bit like Harry Potter. This guy in front, I'm pointing on the right hand side now, this chap here is identical. Oh, actually, let's just get him a bit bigger. And it's these similarities, and really, if I let's just do it. If we cut a selection out of this image and float it on top of the left-hand image, it's amazing how. Let's just we'll just take the bulk of the people here. It's just amazing how they line up. So the only explanation is that they have to be two cameras or a camera, but it's a camera at two different locations, slightly. But I still have some problems with the architecture. So now we have a copy of the other photo. I'm going to float it on top, and I'll change the transparency so we can see through it. Hopefully, this one on the top's got a slight sepia tone. But if we adjust that, we can hopefully line them up and zoom in on the characters. Let's go to this chap standing here first. So we've got him in. You know, you cover he's identical. He's the same orientation and everything. I can't understand how that can be. My man gripping his lapels here, when you float them over the top, he is identical. And I know there's distortion on the photograph, and I've allowed for that, but it doesn't reflect the distortion you see in the architecture, which indicates that the cameras were at quite different locations. This chap here, identical. And then as we go through them now, in proportion to each other, they're in different locations, but they are. Now there's either jiggery-pokery going on, excuse me, or we're looking at something a bit weird. So just as I go through each character, you see that they completely line up. Everything lines up, and I've spent a lot of time on this. This chap here that's I'm putting centre now, you see that he's facing the same way to two cameras. How can that be? When we come back, and then let's have a look at our chap with the guy. Yeah, this chap here, if we put his face over the top, he's orientated exactly the same way, and yet the girl is the same, but they're clearly, the girl's the same. It all matches up. How can that be? I struggle with that. There's a chap here. Let's just remove that layer. Excuse me a second, and just go back to the two photographs. Let's just zoom in a bit. We're about the same size. I'm sorry about this. I mean, it's dreadfully crude. But there's no denying it. We've got two photographs that are different, but curiously identical in so many ways, and it's the people that make it so. Let's just have a look. Let's have a look from the bottom right corner again. And I'm sorry to labour this, but it is in the detail. This I'll post stills at the end of this piece to allow you to compare, and I'm happy to send you copies for better analysis. My tech stuff is really quite limited. But if we zoom in, let's just have a look. If we zoom in on excuse me, these young chaps here, and let's just take it, and I know the quality is very poor. We can see that they're in the same identical poses. His fingers are identical. You could float them on top of one on top of the other, and you would see, excuse me, just get it the same size, you would see that they match perfectly. So we have this peculiar thing where they are taken from two different angles, but they're all looking at the camera or looking in the same orientation. I don't understand that how that can happen. They would need to turn slightly. This chap, if we just scroll both of them along so we can get a bit more, let's get these three dudes here. Oh, there's another one there. So we've got this chap here with the cap, the tallest one, or the one at the back. This one at the foreground has turned slightly, and he looks curious there. And this one that's looking at him, or this chap that's looking at him, I should say, is looking at the camera here. But you've got the same orientation with this chap down in the bottom right, and then you've got this chap that's behind. He's again looking at the camera. It's the same. You float that over that, he's holding his books. It's the same. He's not moved one bit. It's exactly the same. Bang, bang. I find that curious. This guy who's leaning on the door frame here, and there's a chap behind him who has moved. A little bit low. Let's get him. When we look at that, chap behind him has moved. Let's get it on the pointer. Excuse me. And this chap is identical. Seems to be an anomaly on the photograph there, or something there. But the creases in his clothes are all identical. The way he's posed, he's not moved at all. Like all of these other chaps, he's not moved. But curiously, this one has. He's turned his head from looking to the side to looking straight on. And the chap next to him looking at the camera again. It can only have, if there are two cameras, two photographs, they could only have been taken really just seconds between them, or even if that. And I know people held the pose for a long time, but I'll come to something interesting in a minute about the architecture. And we've got this group of people here. You can see the orientation is quite different. The positioning of these people, the angle would need to be quite far round, but the actual posture is identical. This chap at the back slightly different. He is slightly different. Admittedly, there's about 3 of them that are different, and this chap here, who seems to be holding the boat. I'm going to zoom back a bit, but the people in the boat, although albeit they're at a different, as they have to be, they're at a different orientation, they're curiously identical in their everything. The fingers, everything is identical in the posture, but they're all orientated towards whichever camera is taking the picture, and I don't see how that can happen. If we zoom in, what I found peculiar as well, if we zoom out and just take in some of the architecture, like I say, it was the arches that I found at the end that I found peculiar, in that actually the people at the window, which is because they're clearly from a different people at the windows here. They're clearly from a different viewpoint because of this sign here. But if we zoom back, they're both looking at the camera. They're both looking at the same camera. We're not looking at somebody looking at, do you notice that stuff? That's key. And if you float an image, we do it. If you float a section over, and I know, like I say, this is very crude analysis, but let's just copy and paste it over the top as another layer. What you find, where's it gone? It's down there. What you find is that the match is absolute. When you compare them, obviously it's the same people, but I can't get the orientation issue out of my head. It doesn't fit with what I expect to see because of the differences in the sign. In fact, I should have got that. But when you float one on top of the other, let's just zoom in a bit. When you float one on top, you get a perfect match. These people are in exactly the same. There we go. We got, and the window's different, but the actual orientation of the person, and you can get it. I mean, I've gone through them all, and it's quite peculiar how the orientation of them, that everything matches up except the architecture around them. So did they just turn enough? Every one of them just turn enough to capture that? I struggle with this. let's just have a look at again at the architecture. There's one bit in particular that I noticed that, like I say, the arches at the end, but in fact, let's just do those. If we capture those, because there's clearly a different orientation with regard to this wall on each one, this brick wall. You can see much more of it on the right one than you can on the left, and that's only possible by a change in orientation from the camera, or a viewpoint from the camera. So, did I get that right then? Yeah, so now we've got the arches. Let's zoom in on this one. Do it on this one because it fills the screen whenever I zoom in for some reason. Let's just get them on. Now obviously, excuse me, I'll need to just adjust this a little bit, so let's get a little bit of that. When you line the arches up, the distances between them, it lines up, and for some, I don't think it should. You get a perfect match over the top, and that's just wrong with the fact that there is this difference in orientation excuse me, from the two photographs. They shouldn't line up. There's architectural issues there for me, and I know it's crude, and I know there's nothing scientific about what I'm doing, but from what I understand about geometry, let's just deselect that. From what I understand about geometry, if they are two viewpoints, and they have to be for this architecture, this sign to be different, and these people to be in different orientations to one another, despite most of the poses being absolutely identical. When I zoom in on the oars of the boat, which are two separate things in a 3D space, when I zoom in, when I take a copy, well, let's just get a bit more on that. When I take a copy of the boat and then I float it over the top of the other photograph, let's just paste new layer. Right, okay. Oh, I should have got more of them. Bear with me, let's get more of them because it's worth checking the characters out. Let's just get this again. Should have practiced this more. Right, okay, that'll do. So I've had a few goes at trying to put this online with screen grab, and sorry about this, but this is the best I can do. So let's zoom in. Like I say, I'll post the stills, and please do your own analysis on this. I find it fascinating. Oh, let's just take the transparency down and the sepia one down so that we can still see it but see through it. When you float that on top of the boat, now it doesn't fit on top of the boat because the orientation is different. If we get the back of the boat first, you can see that it drifts out. People drift out, they're all out. The back's lined up but everything else is out, as you'd expect, because the camera has to be at a different angle. But if you float every character over themselves, they fit. So their orientation, despite the architecture of the boat and the buildings being wrong, again you've got this, each character can fit in his own, perfectly within his own, and the fingers and everything are correctly lined. And like I say, I'm horsing through this, but the let's just have a look. See this, there we go, this chap here with the cloth cap, perfectly, the child sat in front of him, you can get it perfectly. Let's just go up to the chap with the, I mean, he's got a cigarette in his mouth, I think, anyway, the chap with the bowler hat. Again, he's out of sort of alignment with the others, but you can still line one photograph on top of him, so he's still in alignment with the camera, and the person behind is peeking over his shoulder there. Again, obviously you see more of them in one photograph, but they're still orientated the same way. What I found fascinating was the oars are in 3D space here, obviously, and the orientation of the camera is different because we know from the sign here in the wall, so it has to be in a different place, and possibly a different zoom setting. So how can the oars, when you line up one picture on top of the other, how can they have the absolute same angle in relation to one another? Because they're in different they overlay perfectly this angle. I think that's a fishing rod actually, but these two that are coming out from the side of the boat in their own geometry, if you like. How can that line up if you've got a camera slightly round? That shouldn't work. You can't have these consistencies, and let's just get rid of that. You can't have these consistencies and inconsistencies in the same space. Surely that wouldn't work. I mean, and what does it for me, and I'm a bit reluctant to say this, but when I first came across this photograph, I studied it, and I was really looking for photo manipulation, and maybe that's what I'm seeing, but it's on a grand scale in terms of what they've done. What I was looking for was photo manipulation, because I was wondering how far it went back. Obviously people have been playing around with photographs, and that's how I came across the King George photograph with the FA Cup that I featured in the previous video. But I studied this at length, this photograph from the book, and I particularly studied the archers here, and a number of the people, this chap with a stick, who is identical in both photographs. And I went to bed that night thinking there's no way these two photographs could exist. When I woke up and I came to look at the photographs, because at that time when I saw them, the archers were completely different. They were a different orientation completely. You couldn't have put one on top of the other, and this chap here was swishing his stick in the water, and he was in a completely different pose. And I distinctly remember those two aspects of the picture, and there was also more people gathered here. You could see the backs of the heads and things. In the morning when I looked at it, I nearly freaked out because it had changed. This chap was now identical in the two photographs. The people had gone, and the archers have aligned, and I believe aligned too much, because now you can float one on top of the other. I'm not sure what I saw. And you believe me or don't believe me, it's fantastical is what it is. But I've been obsessed with this photograph ever since. I've pored over it, and I still believe with the two comparisons that there's something going on here. I can't put these two photographs together. So I'm going to sign off. Please download them or contact me privately through YouTube, and I'll send you the two copies for your own analysis. What I found fascinating was just that you could have these two things, but initially what sparked it off actually was that this photograph changed for me. Within 10 hours, serious aspects of it had just changed, and I believed it was going to continue to change, and I stared at it for a couple of days almost non-stop, thinking, what have I just seen and what is going on? And that's before I became aware of the Mandela Effect and other things, and whether this is related, I don't know. I mean, it obviously happened in your head, in my head. I can't understand what it was that happened, and I still have trouble with putting these two photographs in the same reality. For me, they shouldn't exist, and please feel free to do your own comparisons and see what you think. I mean, the other thing I hadn't touched on was some of the reflections are actually carried through. There's a pattern on the water here that matches both. It's in different. You know what? I suspect the quality of this is just too poor to see it, but I'll put the two stills up for a few seconds after this clip. Thanks for watching.